all of you here, and there are many new faces who I do not think are my students, so you are certainly welcome to join us on our campus anytime. This event is part of our Decision 2020 series here at Winthrop University. We strive to educate our students and the community on different issues that are happening around us, and particularly right now with the Democratic primaries on elections and politics. You may have seen some students standing outside at a table. They're there to help you register to vote. So if you are not registered to vote on your way out, please feel free to stop by our table. My name is Katarina Moyen. I'm the director of the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy here at Winthrop University. The West Forum is here because of the generosity of the former governor's family to Winthrop University, and we are happy to be able to engage in civic learning because of the West Forum. So on behalf of Winthrop University and the West Forum, thank you for being here tonight, and we hope that you enjoy the show.
My name is Joe O'Connor. I'm the CEO of WFAE, your NPR news station, and want to thank Winthrop University. I'm wearing a tie in the colors of the university to try and fit in. I also not to be confused with one of your students, I think, as well, Katarina. So I think we're waiting for some students to come in. That's why we're a little bit delayed tonight, so thanks for your patience. I have never known in my lifetime in the news business a time when the news, particularly politics, the volume of news by the tweet, by the minute, by the hour, has been more voluminous and in some cases more chaotic. And that's why we're so glad that not only you're here, but that you listen and support WFAE because we are growing our staff in order to cover the increasing volume of news as other news organizations have been from their economic model, forcing themselves to thin out more and more. So thank you for that support. A couple of things. We love being in South Carolina. We're not here enough, but we also will be here on February 28th at Amelie's in Rock Hill. That's the day before the primary. So since this is becoming the global focus, political focus of the world, we want to make sure we come back here. So please join us at Amelie's at 9 a.m. It's going to be a live broadcast, Charlotte Talks weekly news roundup. Have I forgotten anything, Wendy? Other than introducing you, the executive producer of Charlotte Talks, Wendy Herke.
Good evening. I also want to mention that we've got this great thing that we started doing on Charlotte Talks every Monday. So if you enjoy politics in this process, we do Politics Monday every Monday on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. If you can listen to 90.7, or you can find us online at WFAE.org. And you may also see our signs here for our new podcast called Inside Politics. That's the RNC in Charlotte, hosted by Steve Harrison and Lisa Ward from WFAE. So you can check that out as well. So come and see us at Amelie's on February 28th. And of course, enjoy tonight. If you want to listen again in the morning, we're going to air this tomorrow morning at 9 on WFAE. So if you could put your cell phones on silent, that would be great. And we'll get started in just a moment. Did I miss anything? Hi.
Hi.
Mike Collins.
How are you? So how many of your students, not many, but Mike, how many of you have already decided who you're voting for in the primary? How many of you would vote for, in the general election, for somebody you don't vote for in the primary? What's the most important issue? Just yell it out all at once. Okay, so okay. We'll have some audience questions when we're done with our radio portion of this. So if something occurs to you, just keep it in the back of your head, and we'll bring a microphone to you at the end of the evening, and we'll get those questions answered. All right, let me just get a little drink of water, and then we can start, because I have at least 30 seconds of stuff to write. What? Yeah, Joe, you can start. We don't know what this music is, but for 22 years we've heard it every time we do this show. That's right, I couldn't write about it if you change it. Then where would we be? Campus Center on the campus of Winthrop University in Rock Hill. This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. Iowa and New Hampshire are in the rearview mirror. Now all eyes are on kinda Nevada, but really South Carolina, and they're first in the South primary. The state has played a pivotal role in previous nomination contests because of its sizable number of African American voters. Vice President Joe Biden has been counting on them to push him up in the rankings, and they may, or they could, end his candidacy. Indeed, there's at stake for multiple candidates here as they try to convince voters that they are the best one to go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump. So what do South Carolina voters want? What messages might be resonating with them? What do these candidates have to do to break through before Nevada and Super Tuesday? Well, for answers, we're going to turn to an expert panel. Dr. Scott Huffman has invited us to his home. He's a professor of political science and director of the Winthrop Poll here at Winthrop University. Thanks for inviting us. Appreciate it. Also with us is Meg Kennard, national politics reporter for the Associated Press.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Knox has come up here from the College of Charleston, where he too is a professor of political science and co-author of First in the South, Why South Carolina's Presidential Primary Matters. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
And Antoine Sila, I believe, is a Winthrop alum, and he is a Democratic strategist and CBS News political contributor. Thank you for being here as well.
Thank you.
So, since you drove all the way from the College of Charleston, and because of the name of your book, I'm talking to you first, Gibbs. I'm going to ask you...
Thanks for the book.
You're welcome. Here's another one. I'm going to ask the obvious question. Why does South Carolina's primary matter?
So it matters for different reasons for Republicans and for Democrats. And since we have a Democratic primary coming up, I'll sort of take the Democratic side of it. South Carolina adds critical diversity to the early primary states. You've got Iowa and New Hampshire, two of the states with the least diverse states in the country, starting things off. In South Carolina, in 2016, about 60% of primary voters were African American. And so, given the importance of African American voters to the Democratic Party, it's critical to have some balance. It also is a state that's a little more moderate than the National Democratic Party as a whole, and so it provides some, ideological balance as well.
So Joe Biden said in Columbia last night, or Tuesday night, whenever the election was in Iowa, in New Hampshire, when he said, don't count me out yet, I'm paraphrasing here, because there've only been two states, and he was talking really to the African-American audience.
The two least diverse states and two of the least representative states, even for Democratic voters, and so South Carolina is very, very different. And just because you can win in Iowa and New Hampshire doesn't mean you can win in South Carolina. He was correct.
Yeah, I would say there's a second part of that too. In addition to the first test of minority support, which is critical, and that's a huge block of your coalition, we are the first measure of enthusiasm among minority voters as well. Because you look at 2016, obviously you see, Hillary Clinton, African Americans lined up behind Hillary Clinton. She spanked Bernie Sanders to the tune, I think, 47 points passing. But turnout for 2016 was dramatically lower in that than the turnout for the Democratic presidential primary in 2008, and that basically was a harbinger of what was happening in the general election, where African American turnout was down 7%. So it's not just who, and I think Biden said the black and the brown voters are going to support, it's enthusiasm for a candidate as well.
Antoine.
Always look back through the lens of history. Since 1992, no Democratic candidate has gone on to be our party's nominee without winning the South Carolina primary, with one exception, in 2004, when I was a freshman here at Winthrop. In 2004, when neighboring son John Edwards beat John Kerry in the presidential primary. And then the second thing, no candidate since 1992 has gone on to be our party's nominee without wide, broad support from the most loyal constituency in this party, African American voters. And while Iowa may get attention, New Hampshire may get some praise, and Nevada may get some smiles, the ball game has always been in South Carolina. I remember as a young student in 2004 2008 when I was working for Hillary Clinton on this campus. South Carolina was a launch pad and a safe haven for Barack Obama. I'm convinced he could have won Iowa, but had he stumbled in South Carolina, the country would be different today and that race would have been different. Had Hillary Clinton stumbled in South Carolina in 2016 here, where I worked for, she never would have gone on to be the historic first woman nominee to represent a major party for president.
Is Joe Biden likely to stumble here, or is he going to get the vote he's hoping for here?
I think Joe Biden has a grip lock on the African-American vote here, and I spoke to the vice president on his way to South Carolina Tuesday night, and the one thing I jokingly said to him, I said, when things are when you're looking to be in trouble, you always find yourself going home.
Yeah.
Because home you can find comfort, and you can find a blessed assurance. For Joe Biden, that place is South Carolina, because trust, relatability, reliability, and dependability. He's always been that to South Carolina voters.
So Antoine is clearly a partisan, but you are not, Meg, and you talk to everybody in the state.
I'm a clear partisan hack.
Reporter for the Associated Press. What are you hearing as you talk to politicians and to voters?
What I'm hearing is a lot of what we've expressed, that there's a need and a desire among many voters out there to pick somebody who's going to defeat Donald Trump in November. That's not everybody's top answer, but it is an answer that I hear over and over among people who haven't really decided yet. There are still undecided voters, and we all get paid to pay attention to this, and we've been paying attention to it for well over a year now. But most people, particularly here in South Carolina, are really just tuning in because the votes are soon, and they are going to need to be making those decisions. But I don't think it can be overstated, as Gibbs hit on, and as we've all discussed, the importance of the diversity of the South Carolina electorate. I mean, I was looking at some stuff the other day. There are more African Americans in the city of Sumter, South Carolina, than there are in the entire state of New Hampshire. Sumter, as you guys might know, is not our largest city. So that's one way to kind of just quantify really what we're talking about when we say diversity in South Carolina. Obviously, that black vote is not monolithic, and that's something that I'm continually trying to express in my reporting, which goes out to a national audience, and, reminding people, okay, we talk about black voters, but that's not one group that all will vote for the same person. As Antoine was just noting, Joe Biden does have strong support in that community in South Carolina, but there are other candidates who have been for months building up attention and support within some of those corners here. And so it's going to be interesting for folks like us to watch and see how much of that support remains with Joe Biden when the votes actually come in, and what other candidates perhaps have been able to cleave some of that away, because he has had a long record, a long relationship with South Carolina, but there are other candidates who have been competing for that attention.
When we say the word diversity, it means different things to different people. Keep in mind, we always throw out the African-American number, 61%. I'm very proud of that number. But also 55% women are likely to participate in this primary. Well, we all know, women have a very loud voice in the Democratic platform. And they're nominated by constituents. Absolutely. So when we talk about diversity being our strength in South Carolina, it's not just African-American voters, it's women too. In the 2018 midterms, there were 1 million between women and people of color vote for Democrats in the general election. I think that says everything about the mood and temperature of this party, particularly in South Carolina.
You want to jump in here, Ken?
All I wanted to say was, I certainly think Antoine's right that Joe Biden is a force to be reckoned with. He's had the February 29th circle on his calendar for a long time. Now it's highlighted, starred. He's ready for the South Carolina primary, but it is an open primary, and we don't register by party, unlike in North Carolina. We don't register by party, and anyone can vote, and there's not a Republican primary on that same day. And so, I think it is possible that somebody who voted for John Kasich or maybe even Marco Rubio last time around in 2016 could show up and consider somebody like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar.
I'm glad you brought that up, that it's not like North Carolina. We have a lot of listeners, as you might imagine, in North Carolina, and this is not the same rules at play here, Scott. So tell me how this works, because there is no early voting. It's very difficult to vote early in South Carolina.
Well, it's not formally early voting. So basically in North Carolina, you can early vote. You show up at many different places and do it. In South Carolina, you have to have an excuse. Now, you make one up, I'm going to be on vacation, my mom's going to be sick, whatever it is, and they'll usually...
have to wash my dog.
I have to wash my dog. And so you usually have to go to the county registrar and do that. I believe last election was the first time I saw several places set up where you could go and cast an absentee ballot. And again, you can vote in any primary as long as they're not on technically 10 years ago, you could vote in both, and they passed a law around that. But you could, you have to declare which one you're voting in, but you can switch anything time to time.
So why should South Carolina have such an important role to play? We've been asking questions like, why Iowa? Why New Hampshire, these small states that are not representative of the country? Why do they get to go first? Why should South Carolina have such an important role in this?
Well, because South Carolina is a snapshot of what Super Tuesday will look like. So essentially, we are the alley-oop for the Super Tuesday to be the slam dunk. And that's been very true, again, since 1992. But I want to go back to one point we were speaking about earlier, and it's about who's showing up. The reason Joe Biden has been successful to this point, and I say to this point, is because within the African-American community, he has a strong constituency. Seasoned African-American voters are very decisive and they're very definitive about their support for Joe Biden versus the other candidates. They're fighting for the leftovers or the Twitter voters, the people who make noise on social media but may not always show up.
Meg, I think Joe thought he was going to win in both Iowa and in New Hampshire. I think you assumed he would, but he didn't. And the surprise there, I think, was not just how Bernie Sanders did, but how well Pete Buttigieg did. Will South Carolina voters look at that, maybe voters who were thinking about Biden or even completely sold on Biden,
Right.
and now say, well, maybe I should rethink this?
Well, first off, I don't think that Vice President Biden thought he was going to win those two states.
Okay.
I think that he has been managing expectations in some early states, but also heavily focusing on South Carolina. So I'd say that first. But secondly, of all the voters I speak with, they tell me many things, but among them is, we don't care what these other earlier states did. We care about South Carolina, and ultimately, South Carolina is going to do what South Carolina is going to do. For a lot of reasons, as we've just noted, there's a different electorate here, there are different issues at play, and there is, I don't think there's a huge role played by the winners of those first two states. That doesn't mean that the people who won there wouldn't potentially do well here themselves as well, but I don't think that voters are really seriously considering, okay, well, this person was a 1 or 2, okay, well, they're going to be my choice.
Let me give you an example from 2008. A lot of folks said, oh, well, in South Carolina, African Americans only considered Barack Obama because he won in Iowa. We did a poll of black voters in fall of 2007 and found that Barack Obama was already number 1 among African American men, and he was equally tied among African American women with him, Hillary Clinton, and undecided. So they were not looking to Iowa.
Anything about what's happened so far in Iowa and New Hampshire surprise you about this year's contest?
Yes, the enthusiasm for pragmatism in states that traditionally may trend to be more liberal, that was very surprising for me. The rise of Mayor Pete and this clear momentum that this process is existing. But going back to one point, this lady stopped me in the airport on my way here, and she said to me, we were talking and she read a quote, and she said, Antoine, we could give 2 flying kites about what voters in Iowa and New Hampshire have done.
I want to come back and talk about pragmatism, because that is what's where the African-American vote has traditionally been like. They've been pragmatic about it. We'll talk about that. Antoine Searock is with us, along with Gib Nance, Meg Kennard, and Scott Huffman. We're live from Winthrop University on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. How do you want to do this? Yeah.
Is she really using Clomentum?
Who spiked the water? I'm very happy about that. All right. Okay, ready? It's Charlotte Talks on this. We're funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. We're coming to you from Winthrop University and the DeGiorgio Campus Center with a all-star panel. Scott Huffman from Winthrop University, political scientist here and the director of the Winthrop Poll. Meg Kennard, national politics reporter for the Associated Press. Gib Knotts drove up here from the College of Charleston as a professor of political science there and the author of First in the South, Why South Carolina's Presidential Primary Matters, and Antoine C. a Democratic strategist and a political contributor to CBS News and other outlets. The 538 poll, as of February the 11th, had Joe Biden still ahead of Sanders, though trading down. I think this is national. Star, Warren, Bloomberg, Buttigieg were taking up the rear. Now, you do a Winthrop poll, Scott. Have you done any polling recently on this?
Well, we did one earlier, and we are literally in the field right now as we record this. And so what we saw before is obviously all the expectations, Biden, strongly ahead. But one of the things we saw that the crowd, came out a little different when you asked earlier is what is most important. Now, everybody kind of expected, we got to beat Trump, but there was a clear divide among white respondents in the last Winthrop poll and African Americans in the last Winthrop poll of Democrats that white respondents who were more liberal said, beat Trump, no matter what, that's the most important thing. African Americans were far more likely to say they wanted somebody whose values and views matched their own. They wanted trust.
I don't want to get too far off the track here because this is about the South Carolina primary, but I do have two political scientists here. Should this be about defeating Trump for Democrats, given the fact that apparently the rule of law is slipping through our fingers?
Yeah, I think it has to be, whoever gets the nomination has to put a vision forward that people can get excited about. I think just voting motivation to get out and can help with turnout, to beat Trump can help with turnout, can help with a lot of things. But if a candidate makes that their only policy, that is not a winning formula.
In 2016, I think African-American voters here in South Carolina supported Hillary over Joe Biden. So why does Joe Biden consider, Meg, this to be his firewall?
2008.
2008.
Okay. I get them. All these years run together for me. Old.
We've been doing this a long time. Joe Biden has been building relationships here for decades. Every time I see him on the trail, which has been a lot, he talks about his relationship, particularly with Fritz Hollings, who was one of South Carolina's longest-serving politicians. And Vice President Biden talks about how when his wife and daughter were tragically killed in a car accident right before he entered the U.S. Senate, it was Senator Hollings and his wife Pizzi who helped persuade him to actually take his seat instead of grieving and going on to something else more privately. So it's not just that, but it is part of that keeps Joe Biden tied to South Carolina. He has really been long-term developing these friendships, relationships with politicians even across the aisle. Strom Thurmond was an ally of his, if not always politically, at least somebody with whom he had a strong relationship when they both served in the Senate. And he spoke at Senator Thurmond's funeral. I think that he's referenced that, not maybe as much recently during this campaign, but certainly that relationship is there as well. And personally, the Bidens have come here for vacations. Even Jill Biden referenced last night when they were appearing in Columbia how after the death of their son, Beau, South Carolina was a place where the family kind of came to grieve and come together. So for all of those reasons, the Bidens have been tied to this place. And politically, obviously, it's been a place for him to continue to come and campaign during the various times that he's run for office. So he's tied in multiple.
I would argue that trust was, while the soil was tilled with all those long-term relationships, the seed wasn't planted for that trust to grow until he became, the right-hand man for Barack Obama. You got to remember the who are we going to trust as African Americans to vote for. It was not necessarily Joe Biden who described Barack Obama as clean and articulate and stuck his foot in his mouth every other day, even though he had a strong relationship. It wasn't until he proved his loyalty to the first African-American president that we begin to see those levels of trust grow.
How important is that, the fact that he was a good soldier to the first African-American president, Antoine?
I think it's critically important. I think that was the validator for Joe Biden's career, for the second leg of his career. And make no mistake, Joe Biden is one of very few national Democrats that can come to a place like South Carolina and campaign for a place where it will not be used against him. And secondly, the reason South Carolina is so politically sexy for the VP is because it's a place where he can put together a true coalition. While we talk about beating Donald Trump, I always tell Democrats we should be focused on a candidate who can put together the right coalition to take on Donald Trump and bring this party together. And I think Joe Biden's South Carolina, between African Americans, progressive whites, and some in the middle of the road Republicans, is the right type of coalition we're going to need to beat Donald Trump in November.
But African Americans historically have been pretty pragmatic. They're not as emotional as the Bernie voters seem to be, and invested that way. So I would think they are looking for somebody who can win. If it appears that Joe Biden can't win, will they abandon him? Will they jump ship and go to somebody who they think can and will be in their best interest?
There's two things about African Americans. One, we've always been bold, not necessarily progressive. And two, we are very loyal to a fault. And so I don't see a need to abandon Joe Biden just because another section of the country or some of the media insiders want to write his political benediction to this point. I think African-American voters will actually shock the country and show their loyalty to Vice President Biden in the South Carolina primary, and I think that's going to send a strong signal to some of the Super Tuesday states, especially those who are in the South.
On Tuesday night in Columbia, Biden seemed to be responding to Donald Trump's allegation that Democrats have used and taken for granted African-American voters for a long time. Biden said, too often your loyalty, your commitment, your support for this party has been taken for granted. I give you my word as a Biden that I never, ever, ever will. Was that a wise admission to make about Democrats?
It was certainly a strong statement on behalf of the VP, but let's remember, South Carolina is critical to him, and for all the reasons that we've noted, it's in large part the black voting audience to whom he really continue to appeal. He has said himself, high-ranking members of his campaign have said repeatedly and recently that they really need South Carolina to do exactly what Antoine was just talking about in terms of propel him into Super Tuesday. There are delegates at stake in South Carolina. There's not a ton, but there are a ton at stake in Super Tuesday. And for all of those reasons, he needs a strong performance in South Carolina to jump through and get to those states.
How many delegates are there at stake here?
54.
Isn't that almost exactly what the total gain so far?
65, 41, and 24.
So whoever takes South Carolina kind of goes to the at least second place, if not to the lead. If not Joe Biden, Gibbs, who here?
You know, I think he's certainly the favorite, but if you put me on the spot and made me predict, I do think Bernie Sanders can get, 20%, 25%. So if Biden were to falter and, he somewhere drop below 20 and several of these other candidates were to pick up some people, maybe Bernie Sanders, Tom Steyer has polled pretty well, but I just don't have a sense, that was all before, this thing sorted out a little bit now.
There are certainly regional differences among Americans in the country, but we're all Americans. At least I think we are still.
Well, I want to point out, when we say, Biden falter, don't think of that as just losing.
Right.
He needs to have a decisive win. We have talked about this multiple times. He has got to have double digits, preferably strong double digits. He could win South Carolina, but come out with a single-digit win, and he is limping out, and, it becomes desperate on Super Tuesday.
That's why the story coming out of South Carolina on February 29th is going to be threefold. It's going to be what Biden did. The second fold is going to be who was the fight for second place, because they're going to claim victory going into Super Tuesday for the purposes of momentum and money. And then the third story is going to be who's going to actually go away after South Carolina. If I were a betting man, which I'm not because I don't have money, Elizabeth Warren has the most to lose in South Carolina, because if her oxygen is cut off on February 29th, I don't see how she can go to rehab and keep herself going.
And some have said she should have already pulled out, should she?
Yeah,
I mean, it doesn't look, certainly if she didn't do well in New Hampshire, this is not particularly friendly environment for Elizabeth Warren, and then she's got, Bernie Sanders competing for many of the same voters.
She's having a hard time with funding. She just pulled down all of her ads in South Carolina and is shifting some of that money to Nevada and also to Maine, which is among the Super Tuesday states. So in terms of Elizabeth Warren's campaigns, she is making some of those decisions, but I want to go back to what Gibbs was just talking about in terms of Tom Steyer. He is one of those candidates who has been making a hard play for South Carolina, trying to appeal directly to black voters here. He's rolled out his HBCU policy here in the state, his criminal justice policy he rolled out in conjunction with a trip to South Carolina. His wife, Kat, just literally moved to South Carolina for the duration of the campaign, not just through our primary, but for as long as he's in the race. So he's got the money to do it, but he is making very visible strides to cut into the South Carolina support that I think directly he's aiming to take from Joe Biden in terms of the African-American community.
And he's going to become a push and pull candidate. He's going to push the policy agenda and push other people's support to the edge as much as he can. And he's going to pull support, I think, from various places in order to position him for second. This is a fight for second for Tom Steyer. He's very clear about his strategy.
So talk to me about South Carolina voters then, Gibbs, because, it seems to me that Bernie Sanders is not going to play as well here as perhaps he did in New Hampshire. But does he still speak at all to South? Are there people out there who want health care for all and their college loans forgiven, et cetera?
I think that there certainly are some people that want those things. But some positives for Bernie Sanders is that one of the things we found when we asked about the importance of the economy, I looked at exit polls that looked at the importance of the economy. South Carolina voters tended to talk more about the economy than voters, the typical Democratic voter. Bernie Sanders obviously has an economic appeal, but at the same token, South Carolina Democrats tend to be a little more moderate. They tend to be a little more religious. They tend to be some things that, Bernie Sanders, is not going to appeal to quite as well. And so I think there's a real ceiling for Bernie Sanders.
So where does that put Pete Buttigieg?
So on Mayor Pete, obviously faith is important for Republican voters and Democratic voters in South Carolina. He's probably talked the most about faith of any candidate. He's also a veteran, and this is a state with a lot of veterans. But I think there are going to be. This is a socially conservative state. I think the vast majority of Democratic voters are not going to think twice about casting, considering that he's a gay man, gay 38-year-old.
They are not.
I think the vast majority of Democratic voters are not, but I think there are some in a conservative state like South Carolina that he's going to be hurt by that at some level, even in a Democratic primary. And so, and also think, Buttigieg just, has, the thing that hurts him in a lot of places is just his lack of experience. He's the mayor of a town about the size of Columbia or North Charleston, and that's not necessarily the best experience for being a president.
Well, also, you have to look at kind of the big picture. Early on, I would have reporters ask me questions, say, look at this Bernie Sanders rally, look at this Pete Buttigieg rally, it's just packed. And I would say, tell me about the race in it. Tell me about the race, and it would be all white. So you have to take a step back and say what kind of momentum is really there. I've had a lot of young people say, oh, well, among our group, these candidates are doing great. We like Elizabeth, or we really like Bernie. And I'd say, well, that's great. But in the last two cycles, 18 to 24-year-olds went up about 6% of the electorate. So, you could, if you turn out at that rate again, you could all vote one way, and it's not going to make a difference in the general election. So either things have to fundamentally change about who turns out, or we need to take a kind of a bigger picture view.
Right.
I think there's one thing that's important to consider when you talk about crowds, crowd sizes, and crowd demographics. I'm among those reporters who've been at those rallies for Mayor Pete and for Bernie and for Senator Warren and seen thousands of people, most of whom were pretty white, and thought, wow, what does this say for this candidate's support? You have to look beneath that, and I think that's just important for voters to consider. I've talked to many of the candidates themselves, as well as their strategists and people working on their campaigns, and mentioning that and saying, these crowds are really white, This state is not. What are you doing to actually campaign to many of these people who are going to be deciding who wins this primary? And there's so much that happens behind the scenes for the campaigns that I feel are probably doing it right or are doing it better than others in terms of things you don't see. There are many voters in this state who might fall into a certain demographic who don't have time to go sit at a rally for 4 hours on a work day or a Saturday, or they're working several jobs, or they just have something else they'd like to do with their family. So it's tough to look at those crowds and think, oh, well, this is indicative of necessarily this candidate's support.
Mayor Pete seems to have an African-American problem, not just here, but around the country. What can he do to convince African-Americans that he will be their advocate, their champion in the White House?
I think it's a problem that goes beyond this presidential nominating process, and I think he has a math problem. And there's no mathematical way possible to be the Democratic nominee without going through the heart and soul of the African-American community. So I think he has a problem. But going back to crowds and what does that mean? If you look at some of the bigger crowds that have happened in South Carolina, they've always happened in border places. They've happened here in Rock Hill. We have a border of Charlotte. They happen in Augusta, Georgia, and Beaufort, and places like. And so a lot of the voters that show up are not necessarily South Carolina voters. And so while they pump up numbers and they look sexy on the TV, and people think, wow, the enthusiasm is so high, most of those people could not show up in the South Carolina voting booth and press the button if they wanted to. And so I think the devil is always in the details when you see just a snapshot on TV or what a reporter may report. No disrespect, Mayor.
None taken. I will say, as that reporter at this rally, sometimes it's really hard to find a South Carolina voter, and that's no offense to North Carolina. That's really who I want to talk to.
The one person who has not come up in this conversation a lot is Amy Klobuchar, and she has surged, evidently, at least... That's how it came up.
A good one, Anton.
She's surged in New Hampshire. What are you hearing about Amy Klobuchar here? In a state that has had a female governor, so they understand that women can lead.
I mean, I'm hearing that people like her, but they're just not sure. She hasn't spent a whole lot of time in South Carolina. She has been here for some big campaign events. She walked in the MLK March and spoke at the rally at King Day at the Dome. That was a big candidate event and an important one. But in terms of individual campaigning events, she hasn't really been here and spent the time. And so voters are aware of her, and they've seen what she's done in those other states, but as we've already mentioned, they don't really care, and they're not going to vote based on what those results are. So they feel like they really haven't had an opportunity to develop that relationship with her.
I would argue her surprise, showing in New Hampshire means that strategically she'll probably leapfrog us and focus a lot on Super Tuesday.
Gibbs.
We had her on campus. She was able to make it to the College of Charleston, way fewer people than Bernie and Mayor Pete and Elizabeth. But what I will say is, she got a big bump from the debate. We do have the South Carolina debate. There is an opportunity for her to capture attention, and if she's able to have another really strong debate performances, may get some of those in Greenville and Charleston and Columbia to come out and consider and vote for.
That debate's on February 25th. We're talking to Gibbs Knotts, Professor of Political Science at the College of Charleston, Meg Kennard, Associated Press, National Political Reporter, Scott Huffman, Political Scientist here at Winthrop University, and Antoine Seeley, the Democratic Strategist. We're coming to you from DeGiorgio Campus Center on the campus of Winthrop University. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Ask Newt Gingrich what a good debate performance would do.
He had the two, right?
Okay.
I attended that one.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, that was fast.
Yes, we're ready. Hang on just a second.
Usually
Put the bottle cap back on.
Horribly terrifying.
It actually surprised me.
Yeah.
Okay, you ready? Are you ready, Jeremy? The pilot is not in the seat. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're on the campus of Winthrop University this evening with a stunning crowd in front of us. We talk about the upcoming South Carolina primary and the role that this state will play in the picking of the next Democratic candidate for president. Scott Huffman invited us here. He's the professor of political science at Winthrop University. Meg Kennard is a national political reporter with the Associated Press. Gibbs Knox is with the College of Charleston, and Antoine Seawright is a CBS News political analyst, among other things. And you wanted to follow up, Antoine, on Amy Klobuchar, because you say she has a tougher problem with African-American voters than Pete Buttigieg does.
They are dipping from the same bucket when it comes to their lack of support from the political concrete of this party. And that's been clear. And here's the other thing, and Amy's a friend, so I can say this. Here's the other problem she's going to meet as she visits Nevada and South Carolina. This court case that's lingering over her head, in which arguably an African-American was seen to be done wrong while she was a prosecutor. So just like Kamala Harris, former prosecutor, she's going to have to face her record. And trust me when I tell you, her enemies in this nominating process is going to use that against her to define her going into South Carolina, where African Americans are clear about they want a candidate they can trust.
Well, here's somebody else. Here's somebody else we haven't talked about, Michael Bloomberg. He has the stop and frisk in his back pocket. So how are they viewing that?
Oh, I think the mayor will be defined, especially in the South Carolina debate, once he get on the debate stage. But keep in mind, he's also decided to press the skip button when it comes to South Carolina. So we will not really see the meat come off the bone when it comes to Mayor Bloomberg until Super Tuesday, if candidates have the resources to do so.
Buttigieg says that his win in Iowa and his strong showing in New Hampshire, and he does have the highest delegate count right now, that he's getting a second look from black and Hispanic voters around the country. Is that true, do you think, Meg? And Scott, is it happening here? So I'll start with Meg.
I'm sure he is getting a second look. I think that every time I talk to Mayor Pete, one of the things that he has said to me to try to explain perhaps the lack of support in the African-American community is people just don't know me yet. It's hard to say that at this point, particularly now that places have actually voted.
Well, everybody has TVs.
That introductory phase is over. I don't blame him for saying that maybe, months ago and when he entered the race. But now, certainly, that introductory stuff has already happened. So he really does need to make some big strides to make up some of that ground. It's not just that he has less support than the former vice president, for example, who has always had high numbers. And when you talk to people from the mayor's campaign, they say, well, he started off at 0 in the black community, so at least he's higher than that now. The numbers may not be high, but they do say that shows a sign of forward movement, at least, that there is support growing. But when you think about what the candidates that we've already discussed who aren't Joe Biden, like Tom Steyer, like Bernie Sanders, who really have been working to make those inroads and have been doing it apparently a little bit more successfully, then that is going to be a tough road still for Mayor Buttigieg in South Carolina.
So is he getting a second look from African-American voters here, Scott?
He's more likely to be getting a second look from Bennett supporters, Yang supporters, Cory Booker supporters, Kamala Harris supporters, than he is from folks who were behind and trusting Biden from the beginning among the African-American community. Again, we'll see. I'll see in less than a week.
The mayor of Columbia, Steve Benjamin, an African-American man, Gibbs, has endorsed Mike Bloomberg, who has not campaigned in South Carolina.
You can see some commercials, but not, he's not on the ballot in South Carolina. And a number of mayors across the country have endorsed Bloomberg. Bloomberg is it's in this post-Trump era, it's unprecedented to skip these 4 early primary states and really bank it all on Super Tuesday. We'll know in about a month or two whether that works, but it is a very different strategy and takes somebody with, billions of dollars to even attempt something like that.
He's willing to spend it all, and one of the reasons that the mayor of Columbia decided to endorse him, I think, is because he has the money, the resources, he used the word resources, to go the distance.
Right.
Which means he could go the distance even if he loses all of the primary.
Well, he could go the distance, but imagine a scenario where it's Bloomberg versus Bernie Sanders for the fight for the nomination. And talking about tearing the party apart, somebody who has billions and billions of dollars.
Well, he doesn't care, does he? He's a Republican.
Well, I think Bloomberg has said he would support Sanders. Sanders has said he would support Bloomberg, but that doesn't mean Sanders supporters are going to support Bloomberg, and it doesn't mean Sanders supporters are going to go out and vote. And so it's potential potentially a real dynamite for the Democratic Party, could really cause a lot of problems.
And let me ask the Democrat on this panel. The Democratic Party has a front-runner who's an independent. He caucuses with the Democrats in the Senate, but he doesn't call himself a Democrat. He's not. You got Michael Bloomberg running for president on the Democratic ticket. He's a Republican. Why do you guys let this happen?
Donald Trump is the president. What a time to be alive. We're a diverse party. We brand ourselves as a big tent party, and I'm one of the very few Democrats in the South who welcomes the idea of the big tent. Whether you're a billionaire or whether you're independent from Vermont, if you advocate for our ideas, and if you want to make this little idea called America work, I think Democratic voters will give you a shot, unlike the other side in which they will not give you a shot. And I think we're seeing that being molded and shaped in this nomination process. But I also want to remind you, just because you start out a certain way does not mean you will end up a certain way. And while the momentum may say one thing today, by the time we get to that convention in Wisconsin, it could be a different temperature and different tune in this party.
I'm thinking that I'm right about this, Meg, that this primary will be the first time that we've had so many candidates on the ballot in the South Carolina primary. Usually the field has been narrowed down here. Since we have so many people, who has the best organization in the state?
Wow, asking me to grade the campaigns, that's tough. I will say that, the campaigns who have been working the hardest in developing out probably the most broadly, Bernie Sanders is certainly one. He's had an infrastructure that he was able to maintain to some degree, not a campaign infrastructure, but obviously through the offshoot of his 2016 campaign, through Our Revolution. He has maintained high visibility and hired up very quickly. As we know from the previous cycle, his fundraising has also stayed strong, and so he's had the money to do that. Elizabeth Warren did that pretty largely as well, although, as we've already talked about, her money is starting to become an issue, and so a lot of the big footprint that she's made in places like this is starting to be tough, but it's well organized, and it just remains to be seen exactly how much longer she's going to be able to fund that out. Again, I gotta say, Tom Steyer has a huge ground game organization in South Carolina.
And he spent $14 million in advertising. I don't know what the media markets normally bring in South Carolina, but that sounds like a big chunk of change.
It's a big term. You can't watch a YouTube video, you can't get on the internet without seeing Tom Steyer. And then when you want to take a break and go out and check your mail, there's a flyer from Tom Steyer. So it's unbelievable. But it's not just on, to Meg's point, he's also invested in a ground game that, he's putting the money into the state. It's just, he didn't do well, and he really did nothing in Iowa and New Hampshire, so he doesn't have a lot to build on.
But I see it a different way. I see Tom Steyer making South Carolina an investment, not an expense. And too often in my party, we treat certain segments of the voting bloc as an expense, not an investment. I see it that way. And you asked Meg the question, but I'm going to answer too, about what does a successful campaign look like in South Carolina. I think a successful campaign in this state, and this is true for Super Tuesday, is one that's able to demonstrate their ability to do high tech and high touch. So yes, do all the fancy things like texting and phone calls and all that, but good old-fashioned grassroots politics, knocking on doors, showing up at worship services, going to events, making sure we're going to Walmart and registering voters in the parking lot and harassing college students about registering them to vote. That is how Barack Obama was successful in 2008, and believe it or not, that's how my former client Hillary Clinton was successful here in 2016. It was a combination of a high-tech, high-touch effort.
There's also something that we need to say about Tom Steyer's effort, though. There's a little bit different in that he has hired not one, but two high-ranking, powerful, long-term members of the state legislature to serve as national senior advisors on his campaign.
He just hired State Representative Gilda Cobb Hunter.
That's called high touch.
And she is the longest-serving member in the legislature in the Carolina House, and one of the most influential black lawmakers in the state. She does not endorse candidates, but she's working for him. Isn't that an endorsement?
I mean, I would say so. Representative Cobb Hunter, you're right, always is very adamant in saying that she doesn't endorse, that she doesn't play this, and she keeps her vote to herself. And she still very well may keep her vote to herself, but by being hired on by a campaign and actively working to advise and help someone win the primary, I think you can read a lot into that. The same with State Representative Jerry Govan, who is the chair of the South Carolina Legislative Black Caucus. He's been working for the Steyer campaign for months and has been serving as an advisor and is very much supporting him.
So we have two high-profile African-Americans, Scott, working for Tom Steyer in the state that Joe Biden's hopes and dreams depend on, and a lot of that depends on African-American votes. What message are these two people sending to African-American voters about Tom Steyer versus Joe Biden?
That I need a job, and I'm going to work for somebody who's going to pay me.
Crass, come on.
Yeah, well, I mean, endorsements matter, but they often matter less than people think they do. There really are, kind of signaling, but at this late date, saying, less than a couple of weeks before it goes in, this amounts to a signal for black support. That's not what this amounts to.
And just because they are working for a candidate does not mean that strategy is going to work for the candidate in terms of them winning at the ballot box. And I spoke with Meg about endorsements a couple months ago, and I said to her on the record, endorsements bring some of your friends, but they bring all of your enemies. And that's the one thing I learned. And the sheep does not always follow the shepherd. So while an endorser may feel like they have a certain following and all of their persons are going to follow them, that doesn't always play out. Ask Hillary Clinton, who I worked for in 2008 in the state.
Some say that Tom Steyer is campaigning differently or talking in some way differently to African-American voters than some of the other candidates have been doing or have traditionally done. I'm not sure whether I should ask you this, Meg, or you, Gibbs, so you can both take a shot at it. Do you think that's true?
I do think that he's making a very direct appeal. He has spent a lot of time on HBCU campuses, and he's doing exactly what we were discussing in that whole conversation about crowds and these big rallies and crowd sizes. He's doing what voters tell me they want to see, particularly African-American voters, which is go to where they are, to have small campaign events, smaller style town halls, to hear their concerns, to be in their churches, to be in their small groups. I wrote a big piece about this at the very beginning of this campaign, about the whole notion of campaigning in that way. And he's certainly, I'm not saying he took my advice because I wasn't handing it out, but he's doing what people told me that they really felt candidates should do to be successful here.
Gibbs?
I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. He's really taking the state seriously and really going out and having those one-on-one conversations and building those relationships.
Well, but also to the point of, strategy doesn't necessarily work. I mean, Meg talked about how strong Elizabeth Warren's ground game was, and she made a point of trying to reach out to African-American women who are clearly the crown jewel of the South Carolina Democratic presidential primary, and that's the right strategy. She had a good ground game, and she failed.
And Pete, Joe Biden certainly has, it's his vote caucus to lose. The black vote is his to lose, I suppose. But Pete Buttigieg has spent $2 million in this state, and he's still not resonating with black voters. He's not moving the needle. And Brady Court Garvin, I think she's now working, she's a former chairman of the Charleston Democrats, says it's not for lack of fishing for support, it's just that folks aren't biting. Why not?
Well, again, black voters are loyal, and Pete's problem is not just the surface things that we talk about. It goes back to his days of being a mayor in South Bend, Indiana.
Right.
And so his problems are not just wide, they're very deep, and I think they are playing out in this nomination process. And again, this is a trust election. And so if the mayor does not have trust with African-American voters, you can sure as hell believe they're not going to support him for the highest office in the land.
But in your book, Gibbs, you say that the most interesting thing about South Carolina is what does not matter. You say candidates with fundraising advantages, those who have run for elected office previously, those who have campaigned in a past primary in the state, do not have an advantage over less experienced and underfunded candidates. So to me, that means Pete Buttigieg has the edge.
Well, it's a small state. You can do an event in Greenville, you can go to lunch in Columbia, and then do an event in Charlotte. Charleston. It is a place that candidates who have less money, who have less name recognition, can do well. And, you know, Donald Trump didn't spend as much money as Jeb Bush in South Carolina, but was able to end up ultimately winning the 2016 Republican contest. And so it's still, that's a case that some people want to have a big national primary. We might change the way we select nominees and going into the future. But I will say there are some positives about having smaller states vet candidates and giving candidates more of an opportunity to really go one-on-one with different...
Democrats hope to attract disaffected Republicans across the country. Are there moderate Republicans in South Carolina who might consider voting for a Democrat?
I think so. I mean, look at the South Carolina 1 district with Joe Cunningham. I mean, there's a lot of people who had loyally voted Republican. SC1, Trump won by 13 points in 2016, and Joe Cunningham had one of the biggest upsets in 2018. Now, there are people out there who, you know, like I said, probably voted for John Kasich or Marco Rubio that are thinking about weighing in without a Republican nomination and being dissatisfied with some of the stuff they see from Donald Trump.
What's the chance, very quickly, like 10 seconds, what's the chance, Scott, of a contested convention?
You ask the Democratic expert or the
10 seconds. 100%. This is going to be fun. All right, Antoine C., Democratic strategist, professor of political science at the College of Charleston, Meg Kennard, national reporter with the political reporter for the Associated Press, and Scott Huffman, who has hosted us tonight with coffee and donuts, professor of political science at Winthrop University. Thank you all for the We're gonna take questions from the audience and microphones will flow. Before we started, I got 3 questions from the audience in writing. I'm not sure who wants to take this. Any chance to, this is not a presidential question, which is why I didn't ask it. Any chance to unseat Lindsey Graham?
Weigh in on that a little bit. I mean, it's, you know, Jamie Harrison's a likely nominee. He's raising money. He's doing a lot of things right. You know, Lindsey Graham is super unpopular nationally. But look, I mean, go to the exit polls from 2016 and look at the percent that identify with Republicans. And maybe Scott's going to have a Winthrop poll that's going to sort of contradict what I'm saying. But Republicans start out with a huge advantage in the state. Even an unpopular Lindsey Graham has a big advantage. Every statewide elected official is a Republican. And so I'd put the odds of Lindsey Graham winning really, really high, even though he's popular. I don't know, it's not a popular thing to say. Hopefully, I want to be convinced by some of these panelists that I'm wrong.
Well, you're not wrong.
Thank you, Scott.
Lindsey Graham is probably facing, other than his first election, his absolute strongest challenger. But this state right now is Republican, generic Republican plus 10. And so this strong candidate, is, you can say he's eaten in 4%, 6%, and he's still behind. And beyond that, with regard to Lindsey Graham's popularity, he was the least popular Republican among statewide Republicans, and that changed, and he's now one of the most popular. It's, his performance in the Supreme Court nomination, he basically went from, I think it was 52% support among his own party to 76. It jumped up 24 points. And so the people who are going to show up, and they are, for Donald Trump in large numbers, are also going to pull the lever for, Trump's right-hand defender in South Carolina.
And golfing buddy.
Somebody out there would like one of your thoughts on the Democrats playing dirty like fake Facebook groups designed to sway votes. Would Democrats do such a thing?
Well, I think before you go and convict Democrats of doing that, let's back up and remember it was 2016 in which the Russians, advocating for Donald Trump, put out disinformation campaigns that we know influenced the process. So I'm not saying it's true, but I would just be careful casting a wide net and saying it's Democrats. And number 2, will they do that? Absolutely. Politics is a contact sport. And so your ability to block and tackle will demonstrate your ability to be successful in this business.
Lee Atwater told me in the makeup room at South Carolina ETV, this is 30 years ago, maybe longer, that...
I'm 34.
Okay, well, you probably weren't alive. It was 1981 or something like that. Were you alive then?
No, I was born in 85.
Oh, Lord.
innocent people, I think,
So Lou Atwater in politics, and he meant this absolutely, I think he recanted it later in life, but toward the end of his life, that in politics, the ends always justify the means. And I couldn't get him to say it on the air.
And I'm glad you brought up Lee Atwater. There's a long history of dirty tricks in South Carolina, and certainly in the primary. Kind of one of the biggest ones was when, there was some push polling from George W. Bush saying, would you still support John McCain if he fathered an illegitimate black child? He had an adopted daughter, but it was still, just
Sri Lanka.
From Sri Lanka, right? But it's still just a sort of terrible. One thing about that, I think that, what we didn't study in our book, we recounted a lot of these things, was like, is South Carolina disproportionately dirty? I mean, one possible explanation is just that it's so much at stake in South Carolina. Iowa and New Hampshire, a lot of times, is split. We're seeing that right now, and it could be that the Democrats are pretty good people, like Antoine says, but it's like, there's so much at stake that people are going to basically pull out all the stops. There are millions and millions and millions of dollars. It is all riding for some candidates on the state, and when you're in this strategically important slot, things kind of get dirty, so.
And I would say too, though, I see just as much of it on both sides. And, as someone who is out there as a journalist and aiming to always be right in the middle and objective, especially when covering politics, I believe that's absolutely paramount. I get just as much hate from Democrats sometimes as I get from Republicans because they don't like what it was that I was reporting. Not that I was wrong or that I, really made something up. It just didn't comport with their viewpoint on something. And so I'm not saying that to hate on anybody myself, but I am saying that I think that is something that is very present, particularly in this extremely polarized, active political
And
environment.
you work for one of those organizations, those old line, straight down the middle organizations, the AP, that really chose the line on that, plays it straight. You're almost a dinosaur. Is it difficult to do in this world?
It is difficult, I think, for some. I think it's being objective, though, and I was saying this on a panel earlier today over at the legislature, is the most important thing that anyone who's covering politics can do. It's probably difficult for some people. There are probably some who get into it and realize, you know what, I can't really just stay right in the middle on this. For me, I grew up in a political family. My grandfather was a lawmaker for a very long time in Washington, and so I think that maybe just by osmosis, I don't know, by being around the process my entire life, I really just kind of feel like I bring a perspective to covering politics that is just ingrained in me somewhere. And so for me, I don't find it difficult. And maybe that's a good thing that I am with one of those dinosaur news orgs that really prides itself on being right there in the middle. But it is very paramount and very important for journalists to remember that, especially when there is so much polarization happening on both sides.
I think it's important to remember this old adage in politics I learned very early on. Republicans fall in line, Democrats fall in love. And regardless of what you say about the other side, they may fight amongst each other at one point in time. But when it's all said and done in the end, they're going to come together. And that does not happen on our side. And you talk about the other side with dirt. I've spent 4 years working for Fox News as a contributor, a Democrat, African-American from South Carolina. If you just happen to go to my Twitter any day of the week when I got off the air, you can only imagine some of the stuff that was coming across my Twitter, not to mention people showing up at my house, spray painting racism and hateful things in my driveway, all because they did not agree with something I said about the president. And if you're a Democrat and you're concerned about infighting, keep in mind, again, Donald Trump is the president of the United States.
Well, at 10:48 last night, you were on MSNBC.
11:48.
11:48, excuse me. That late? Okay. You were on MSNBC. Did you get anything hateful on your driveway?
No, thankfully not. But, I'm sure that I always get feedback, and so there's plenty of feedback from folks one way or the other. I will say that particularly earlier on in the campaign, when there were more candidates, and there was, the people who were paying attention at that point so early, like we were, but we get paid to do it, were very, very passionate. And so whenever there would be any bit of news that perhaps wasn't as positive as they would want for the candidate whom they support. I did get a lot of flack and pushback from that. But I will say that I think Twitter is a great thing that's happened to our society. Sure, there's all kinds of hate and nastiness, but it also is a conversation space. And I've been able to, thankfully, really develop relationships and conversations with a lot of those people, even the ones who were saying nasty things to me, because I want to understand why. I would like to get to behind, whatever this is. I mean, they're passionate. They're a voter. Help me understand your process.
And it's like, it's a market, basically, that can sometimes, and again, I don't want to be too out front defending Twitter, but, the Post-and-Courier has a pretty cool thing where you can, it's Charleston paper, where you can report, if you think there's a dirty trick out there or something like that, but they had as their graphic, like a Tom Steyer mailer, because like everybody has Tom Steyer mailer, so they probably just thought that'd be a good idea to use it as a graphic, but it sort of implied that he was involved in dirty tricks, and so I retweeted it. Somebody posted and said, you're making it look like Tom Steyer's in the dirty tricks. I took my tweet down. I don't know if you were allowed to delete a tweet, but, Meg wasn't answering her phone, so I couldn't ask her if I should take the tweet down. I'm just joking. I didn't.
Just blame me.
That's right. But I took it down, but it was like, I apologized and said, look, so I do think there are some positive things about Twitter, but, clearly, when you go off Fox News as a contributor and you have to deal with that nonsense.
This is probably an extreme example, but I will say there was somebody who trolled me for years on Twitter and just, went after me for all kinds of weird stuff, and sometimes, it just didn't make any sense to me at all. But through that relationship building that I was just talking about, I whispered him right down. That guy came to my wedding, okay? So I'm just saying, you can also develop friendships. I prefaced all this by saying that Twitter is a weird, wonderful place, but, it doesn't always have to be hate. There's good stuff in there, too.
What Twitter is, people think it's real. And anyone who has an opinion can almost essentially act as if they have a political science degree from input. And people follow them.
Okay, let's go to the audience here. Antoine, I wanted to ask you, you were talking about getting the black vote with Pete. Now, I see parallels historically. The blacks have always had slavery as just this terrible backpack of hatred and everything else that goes along with that. But Thaddeus Stevens was a representative early, and he is a rogue scholar, handicapped, fought and had a vitriol for slavery, and was completely white, very pragmatic. In Congress, the only way he could get the 14th Amendment through was to basically say, all men aren't equal. All men are not wealthy. All men are not educated. But all men are equal under the law. And that's how he got the Democrats, the Southern Democrats, to get on board. That kind of pragmatism is what Pete brings. He's that rogue scholar. He's that person who has, I wouldn't say handicap, but I would say maybe that discriminatory thing from his sexuality, okay, which for me that doesn't mean much. I'm from California, my best friends were gay, and I'm married, of course, but that's beside the point. It brings in this, we don't want to talk to Pete because we don't really know him, kind of a thing, but yet he can't spend a lot of time in South Carolina. He can't go to these, town halls because he's at a disadvantage, financially, time-wise. I don't know, how do you bring that together to show that he could be a good candidate for the African-American community?
First of all, Pete is a friend, a personal friend, so I have nothing against him there. Second of all, Kamala Harris and Cory Booker are two Rhodes Scholars. The problem with Mayor Pete is black voters, at least the ones I talk to, do not view him as being authentic. And when you're in a trust election, in an environment that's so uncertain, authenticity, genuineness, and honesty is so important. And I go back, it's not because of the things that people talk about on the air that black people have a problem with Pete. It's some problems that go back to his days of when he had the opportunity to make it right with black people, and he failed in that regard. And those things follow you. Any film you've ever played from a game perspective, your opponent is going to go back and view that film and use that against you for the next game. Well, welcome to the big game, Pete. And I think that's what he's experienced. I'm not saying he's not a great candidate. I think he's a hell of a messenger. I think he's a great orator. But I just don't think in this moment he is what African-American voters see as they want for their Democratic nominee. And relationships matter. They matter a whole lot in our community. And to this point, I haven't seen any real validators in the African-American community come out and say, Pete is my candidate, let's embrace him, because that's step one.
And I will say too, I mean, some reporting that I started, I guess at the end of last summer, which feels like it was 10 years ago at this point, as much stuff as we've all done. But I interviewed a lot of faith leaders in the Black community in South Carolina, and one of them, it was part of the headline, I'll never forget it, the quote that he used to describe what it would mean to him as an African-American, as a leader in the NAACP, and as a pastor, a man of faith, that it would be a heavy lift for him to go to his congregation and really make the argument for someone like Mayor Buttigieg. And in large part, a lot of that came from his sexuality and just, trying to explain that to a socially conservative congregation. On the flip side of that, I did interview other faith leaders who really thought that it wasn't as big of a deal, but they weren't, in the majority. I mean, most of what I heard was, we like him. Like Antoine was just saying, he's a friend, or maybe he would be, or we like him personally, and he could be great, but we do have some reservations, and we're not sure that we would be able to get over that. As much as we might support him on policy issues, that's just something that's within us. That's also important that, maybe when it comes time to the general election, if we really want to defeat Donald Trump, well, sure, maybe we could go that way, but in this opportunity zone that we have to kind of pick the nominee, we don't know that we could go there just yet.
I don't think that's the only baggage either. I think his performance as mayor, there were some issues with the police force and, and accusations that he did not do much to assuage racism, issues like that. So I think he came in with a whole lot of baggage that the African-American voters in South Carolina were going to have trouble with already.
And if you talk to most African-American voters in the state, they see Pete as a candidate of privilege. Because again, nobody talked about Cory Booker being a Rhodes Scholar. No one talked about Kamala Harris being a Rhodes Scholar. They all have the same resume. Cory Booker's a U.S. Senator, was a mayor just like Pete. Kamala Harris was a prosecutor and a U.S. Senator. History. But they did not get the media attention as Mayor Pete. So older people see it as a sense of privilege, and they're like, why him and not anyone else? And I think people feel that. And he's taking advantage of the moment, as he should, as a good candidate should. But I think that's part of what somebody said to me yesterday in New Hampshire was they see it as a sense of arrogance, and that's why they can never see themselves supporting him.
Let's go here.
Hi. In the past couple of weeks, Hillary Clinton has come out and said some things about Bernie. And I was just wondering if you had any opinions of why she would make some of those statements.
She's still running?
You talking to me? Well, I worked for her twice, in 2008 and 2016. She's still a good friend, but if I'm old enough to remember the last primary, in which we went to a convention, and there still had to be some convincing for Bernie Sanders to get on board with our party's nominee. And in spite of all that, there were some underlining jabs that took place. His supporters did not go on board. And an election that was so close, determined by 5 or 6 states, and then many of his supporters go out and vote third party or not show up at all, that made a difference. And so if you're Hillary, I would be frustrated too. In fact, my pistita level would probably rise to an all-time high.
Over here? Anybody else?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Somebody has a microphone.
I just had an opinion, a question. What do you think Andrew Yang didn't get as much love during these primaries and eventually had to pull out?
So yeah, we had an Andrew Yang. Did Andrew Yang come to Winthrop? Did you guys have a Yang event?
Did we? No, I don't think.
Event. I mean, College of Charleston, it was, not in that sort of big three, Bernie, Elizabeth Warren, and Mayor Pete, but, he really did connect with maybe a different type of voters, some people that maybe weren't paying as much of attention, certainly a lot of young people. But again, one of the things that Scott said, that's not always the groups of people that are the most reliable, most likely to vote in a primary. I don't think he would have done particularly well here had he stayed in the race, but obviously, in terms of money and the support he got in the first 2 states, he felt like it was time to get out.
Over here.
Yeah, I'm wondering how Biden has been able to maintain the support of African-American women after his treatment of Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas confirmation.
I would argue it's the same way he's able to have African-American support after, his insulting tones towards Obama early on. It's, redemption and showing that, okay, I've got Obama's back, and they were willing to look past it. Otherwise, if he had not had the Obama connection, I'm not sure he would have been able to generate that level of connection and trust just by vacationing here and loving Fritz Holling.
And also, as an African-American on this panel, our history has been one that's always been forgiven, because that's what our faith teaches us. And I think with Anita Hill having some comments about how she's essentially in a different place. And the second thing I remind you, if you name a perfect candidate that's in this political business, please tell me, and I will come hug you right now. Because we all have made some mistakes. We all have had some regrets. But as Joe Clarence said at Fritz Holling's funeral, thank God a man can grow. And I think Vice President Biden, over the years, we've seen him evolve and grow from his mistakes.
And most specifically, too, during this campaign, it was several months ago, I think back in October, when there was some controversy about some comments that the Vice President had made that were viewed as complimentary to segregationists. He came to South Carolina and made a very impactful, emotional speech to apologize for that. And yes, as Antoine said, he was appealing directly to that good-natured and forgiving mentality that he, politically, sure, South Carolina, that's advantageous, but also I think that was seen as a very genuine attempt to say, I'm not perfect, and I'm sorry, and, please forgive me.
Right here.
Hi, yeah. So part of the political crisis that we seem to be going through right now as a country seems to be due to the fact that there has been a slow and steady increase in presidential power over the last several decades. I was wondering how likely it is that we'll hear any political candidate speak about this disproportionate concentration of power at the presidential level.
You mean the people running for president talking about how they want to give up presidential power? Actually, when I describe that in class, I use the term aggrandizement. It's the slow accumulation of power in the presidency, and it began with George Washington. I mean, one of the first things he did was took for the president the right to acknowledge new countries when he took the right to recognize ambassadors. And so the growth of the presidency has been steadily upward, sometimes frighteningly steep, but other times slow and steady. So you're right, the presidency has grown in power. The executive branch has accumulated a lot of power, but I don't think any of these folks are going to try and get the office and actively give up the power.
It is amusing to me, though, sometimes, and I say amusing not really in a funny way, just kind of in an observational way, how many things all the candidates for executive office right now, we're talking about the presidency, how they think they're going to do things on day one, and this is going to be something that I will absolutely get done. And in reality, you all know, and any educated voter knows, that most of that stuff has to go through Congress.
Last week? I'm serious. You can do anything that damn well, please. Bernie Sanders, and I said on day one, I want national health care, and I want to forgive college debt. I've done it.
Well,
How would you stop it?
Well, probably for me to prognosticate what's going on with the current administration and how that really affects things. We are living in interesting times, and I will say that. But in terms of how it plays out in the election, though, I ask that question of people who identify as moderate, as conservative Democrats, who say that they're going to vote for Bernie Sanders. And when I ask that question about, well, what about, a major policy of his that it doesn't comport with anything that you just said you stand for, universal health care, they say, well, that has to go through Congress. He can't do that. So I'm not really worried about it. So that's just one example, but I think that it certainly is, presidential power is something that voters are thinking about, but at least many of them seem like they understand the process it has to go through.
And you know why that's probably true? Because the people have lost their power. The Congress has always been a checkpoint on the executive branch. The legislative branch have always been been a checkpoint on the executive branch. Well, it's true, because we send people to Congress who just want to cuddle and play footsie with what's convenient instead of really being a checkpoint and doing their job. And so if you are concerned about the overreach of power by the executive branch, then you need to send people to the legislative branch who will be a checks and balances to the executive branch. And only people do that.
But isn't that gone now? Seriously, the precedent has been set now.
The precedent has been set, but we can set new precedents. If Democrats, let me say this, because I don't know anybody's political affiliations, if Democrats do what they need to do in November, we'll keep the House, and we can get close enough or flip the Senate. And if Donald Trump probably happens to be reelected, then there will be a real checkpoint. Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats have been the biggest checkpoint when he was president in my political lifetime. Elections have consequences. And so if we show up and we vote interest, then perhaps we will return that power back to the people, and the executive branch will not have such power.
Okay, very good.
Do you foresee anything that could happen to Trump that's going to trip him up between now and the election, whether it's his tax return release, his dealing with the virus, Middle East war, a Korean missile?
Shooting someone on Fifth Avenue.
Trump obviously didn't get impeached. The Mueller report didn't turn out like a lot of people had thought. But, there was a very substantial election in 2018. There are, these polls are, all kind of things can affect these polls from day to day. They've been some movement in them. But, I still think, there are a lot of people that are concerned with what's going on. And I guess the best evidence I would give you is the big surge that happened in the House of Representatives in 2018.
I will tell you that Donald Trump was elected for several reasons. There's a sense of fear, there's a sense of anger, and there's a sense of frustration, and there's a sense of not being able to trust the system. He was elected for those reasons. He's done a great job of playing to those things in order for him to be re-elected. That's why people in his own party are afraid of him, and they're afraid to do the right thing in the name of the betterment of this country, except Mitt Romney. I give him credit where credit is due.
He also went after some traditional Democratic key voters, voting groups, the unions and people like that in the upper Midwest. Is there anybody on the ticket right now, running for office right now from your party, aside from Bernie and maybe Warren, who speaks to those people, appeals to those people, can win those people back?
I think everyone in their own way has the ability to penetrate those voters. It's not persuading them. It's not engaging them. It's persuading them at this point. When we engage with those voters, they're persuaded to vote for us. Unfortunately, in 2016, we got cute and we got away from the basics, the things that elected Bill Clinton twice and Barack Obama twice, and we started doing things that we were test casing on, and we got away from what matters. And so we've gotten back to the basics. That's how we won in 2018. And I think if we stay focused on quality of life issues, keep speaking to the things that matter to those voters, making healthcare a centerpiece of whatever our platform looks like, I think we are at a 60-40 jump ball any day of the week.
Okay. Where are we next? Over here?
Hi. So the country is more interconnected now than it was during its foundation or the succeeding years after. We've had advances in transportation and communication, media, radio, television, and new media, Twitter, the internet, etc. But it seems like the Electoral College is still in place, and I'm kind of wondering what it will take to change that, because the current president really just won the election by a few thousand votes in 3 states in the Midwest, whereas Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by, I think, 3 million votes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I think, it's very possible that, the Trump could lose the popular vote by even more this time and still may win, because, Trump's not gaining support in California and New York, and those are pretty big states. It'll take a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College, and that, just to Scott's point of it takes a president, what's likely that a president's going to try to get rid of presidential power, these states that benefit benefit from this, they've got senators, they're going to have to figure out, how they kind of vote against their state's interest. And so it's going to be very, very difficult to get rid of the Electoral College. I'm a one-person, one-vote kind of person. I'm not a defender of the Electoral College, but I don't think it's very likely to change. But I don't know.
Should states have more than 2 senators? No. California has 2 senators, North Dakota, which has 2 people in it, have 2 senators.
2 senators. Maybe I'm a compromise guy, I'm okay keeping 2 senators, but I'm not, so I'd say we go to a popular vote for the president. But,
Well, the better argument on that is to break California up into 3 to 5 states, and then
That's going to happen. We have about 4 minutes left. So
I'll say one thing. Yes. Democrats, we're going to have to learn how to win elections in the Electoral College. And we haven't figured that out yet. We do it every now and again, but we do not do it consistently. And if you think about the states that Hillary Clinton won in the margins, they were within throwing distance. And a large part of it was because of drop-off with African-American voters in those states. I can tell you because I traveled there, we did not do what we were supposed to do in those 5 or 6 states. The African-American drop-off was real, and as a result, Donald Trump is the nominee.
Okay. Over here.
Hi. It seems to me that Joe Biden is kind of the more obvious candidate for the South Carolina Democratic primary, not only because he was the right-hand man to the first black president, but also he seems to be one of the more major opponents to President Trump, and he's one of the more centralist candidates of his contemporaries. But do you think his blunders early on in his campaign might bring into question his competence, or are there any other factors you think might affect his chances to become a solid candidate?
As a reporter who covered a lot of those quote-unquote, like the missteps and the stumbles and can he really do it and all that, the voters that I talked to, not just the ones who were solidly, I'm all in for Joe, because there were some of those at the very beginning, certainly, and still are, they didn't really seem to care, and they weren't really too fazed by that. I think that we heard a lot on cable news and perhaps on Facebook and a whole lot of these new media places that we were just talking about, where, can he handle it? Is he gone? Is he mentally all there? And, all of those kinds of questions that the Vice President told me he thought were fair to ask of someone of his age, because I specifically asked him, are you too old for this? Should you only do 1 term? That was a kind of uncomfortable interview. But, he said that was all fair points to make, but at least from the voters who, I really do believe are the most important voices to listen to, there didn't really seem to be a whole lot of concern to me about those things. And I think that, and I've wondered why this didn't happen earlier. I'm sure there's a good political reason for it, a campaign reason, but I've wondered earlier why the Vice President didn't address his previous history in childhood stutter, because I think that a lot of, if you look back at some of those earlier circumstances where he would make this verbal miscue, or seemingly so, and apply what we know now about what he has said, what he went through as a child, and still is working through as an adult, it could seem to explain some of that a little bit better. I'm no doctor and not a therapist or anything, but, just looking back through some of that, it does seem that at least verbally and some of those things could perhaps have a little bit of an explanation.
As a young independent, one thing that's very important to me is unity. And, and while Mayor Pete has been judged on his ability to lead experience, one thing that's very important to me is your ability to lead in an atmosphere where everyone is incredibly divided. And I think that he is a candidate for me that has shown that he is able to bridge the party. And in a dream world, I would have a multi-party system, but this is not my dream world. So Mayor Pete is honestly the closest I get to that. As much as I want to ride on Mr. Biden's coattails and his shadow of our Mr. Obama, I feel like that's what he's in. I feel like he gets the leftovers of everyone's ideals and dreams of the glory days of what we had in Obama and the unity that was represented there, and I feel like that's the only thing he has left there. admit this impeachment scandal, it's hard to say Donald Trump without Biden following closely behind. And something that's just really important to me is just something that is a candidate that can project unity, because it takes two to tango, and this is not a multi-party system, this is a two-party system. So I just want to know what's important for you all and your candidate, or why it's not important for you to admit, yes, it's important for us to beat Trump. We're going to be all excited when we see that day. But what follows after that? Because we'll still have blue and we'll still have red, so something that's very important to me is someone that can have a progressive, sight to unite a party and push things that are bipartisan, and that's going to take a lot.
And when you consider the media atmosphere, how can anybody, I don't care who you are, running for president or elected to be president, heal the country when you have factions on both sides with very big microphones?
So I'll start with my party. I'll tell you two things, and I'll quote the great New York philosopher Jay-Z. Number one, nobody wins when the family feuds. And right now, we're seeing the Democratic family feuding in a way that bothers me, considering the 80-pound gorilla we were facing in November called Donald Trump. Number two, we have 99 problems in this party, but lack of unity cannot be one. We saw what happened in 2016 when we're not unified, and we also saw what happened in 2018 when we come together, progressives, independents, moderates. We can take our country back. So I start there, but I think we have to unite our party before we can talk about bringing this country together. And that's what I'm focusing on this primary. Regardless of who the winner is, I want to make sure we bring the four corners of this party together so we can be stronger together.
And I hope you're right, and I want exactly what you want, but, look at Obama, who ran on hope and change and talked about bringing people together, and, he ran a very different campaign in 2012, and it was hard, it was a hard thing to accomplish, and, I think we'd all agree that he was a very talented political leader, but was unable to do, I don't know if you see, there's a new, relatively recent, last couple weeks, Frontline thing on Obama and on kind of how we got from Obama to Trump. If you haven't checked it out, it's a PBS piece. It's really, really good and gets at some of the things that might not make you too optimistic, but maybe you can watch it and learn and then kind of figure out how to move us forward.
So let me end with another question that came in before we even started talking from somebody out here. Besides voting and becoming involved in a campaign, what can we do as citizens to counter our corrupt, their words, government?
Well, becoming a billionaire and donating all that money towards a cause would probably go a long way.
You mean Scott Hoffman?
But how do we get involved? What should people do?
Well, personally, I would argue set attainable goals, and we're talking about keeping your sanity here. That's the underlying part of the question, is somebody who's just so deeply disturbed about, they see it corruption one level. There are elections for city council, there are elections for mayor, there are elections for county council, there are elections for state house, there are elections for state senate, there are elections no longer for lieutenant governor. But we...
Not unless you give them a ticket.
Right, and we don't elect the adjutant general anymore, do we
Correct.
still?
We do
Yeah,
not.
so there's still lots of things that you can get behind. And, one thing I've found is if you can change your little corner of the world, then you have a kind of a better view of the rest of it. When your own yard is overgrown with weeds, it's hard to see what's happening down the street.
And I would echo that too, particularly the local level involvement, whether it's in elected office or whether it's serving on a commission or something in your neighborhood. In 2018, and for a lot of reasons, and I'm not downplaying any of this, but 2018 was just the year of everyone running for Congress. Like every time I turned around, someone was running for Congress. This year, clearly everyone's running for president. There's reasons for that too. But no, seriously, like my inbox was just full of all these people who didn't really seem to have any experience with much of anything, which is fine. I'm not saying you have to, do a stepping stone to whatever your next elected office is going to be, but it was just one thing after another. And so I think that people do forget that it's at that local level where, you really can make so much substantive change and see it happen right in front of you, even if you're not elected to it, if you're just participating participating in something. Whereas in Congress and in other the layers, I mean, you're one voice out of hundreds, and it moves with the speed of an aircraft carrier, and, it's just really, really a slow process.
Most
So-
of your interactions with government happen at a local level.
Yeah, super important.
I would just tell you, find your niche, because what works for some does not work for all. And there's one thing we have to learn in this country and in my party is that we all have a role to play. My involvement started when I was in the 5th grade and I ran for vice president of my student council and won. I took every step I've learned in my life and transferred. When I got to Wimper in 2004, there was no college Democrat chapter at this college. Me and my good friend, Willie Lyles, who's a legislative director for Mr. Clapper, the majority whip, we got together with a few people on campus and we started the organization. That was 2004. Transfer the tape just a little bit. In 2008, I was working on my second presidential campaign in my career, a college student. Now, that may not be the pathway and the journey for everyone, but we all have a role to play in trying to make this little idea called America work. And not everyone's supposed to run for office. I know you hit on running for office, but not everyone has been called to do that. Perhaps you're going to be a reporter. Maybe you're a poster or a political science. Maybe you're a talking head like me. Maybe you're a show host. We all play a role in somehow making this thing work, and I think you have to identify with that. And even if it's not the big flashy things, you still do it so well that you'll make this thing work.
I want to thank everybody on this panel for being here tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you. You do? I'm being told,
February 28th.
but that'll be at 9 o'clock in the morning. Lord, how am I going to make it here by 9 o'clock in the morning? Friday. It's our studio by 9 o'clock in the morning. Thank you all for being here.